Some of you have been using that Kool-Aid phrase without knowing the entire story. Welcome to the Rob Lett Show. I'm your host, Rob Lett. What the left never tells you about Jim Jones. That's the focus of today's podcast. It's November. This month represents the 43rd anniversary of the largest loss of American civilian lives after 9/11. And as big of a deal as that is, there are very few people who really know what the Jonestown Massacre was all about. Yes, you know who Jim Jones was. Yes, you know what he did. But when it comes to why he did it, most people just write it off and say it's because he was a crazy preacher. And there was a lot more to it than that. So we've got a lot to unpack here today. Today we're going to talk about what you think you already know about Jim Jones's career. We're going to talk about what you may not know. We're going to talk about hiding the truth, the beginnings of Jim Jones's career. We're going to talk about birds of a feather, Jim Jones and the Democrat Party. We're going to talk about his rise to power. How did he get so popular? How did he get so powerful? We're going to talk about hell on earth, the communist culture in Jonestown, revolutionary suicide, and the most failed political philosophy on the planet. Before we get started, I'd like you to go ahead and do a few things. First of all, like this video, subscribe to it. If you're on YouTube, to the upper right-hand corner, you're going to see a bell. That's a notifications bell. Click it, and it'll notify you the next time we release a new show. If you're on Rumble, though, to the upper right-hand corner, you'll see a share button. Click it, and it'll share this video with a friend of yours who should have been here today. Go ahead and do all of those things that apply right now. What you think you already know. Have you ever heard someone use this phrase before? Drinking the Kool-Aid?
No matter what you think you see in my cup, I'm not drinking the Kool-Aid.
No, you really drank the Kool-Aid, didn't you?
Drink the Kool-Aid! Maybe you've even used the term yourself before. The phrase drinking the Kool-Aid is an idiom that has been around for 43 years. It's a popular way of saying,
when a person believes fully and without question, we say they're drinking the Kool-Aid.
I know the phrase is 43 years old because on November 18th, 1978, 43 years ago this month, an event happened so tragic that to this day, it's the largest loss of American civilian lives after 9/11. A total of 909 people died in the incident. The event was so tragic, I'm not even going to show you a photo of it. I don't even think YouTube would allow me to. Additionally, I'm not going to show you the photos in respect to the families of those who are still alive today and may be watching this. If you want to see those photos, you'll have to find them yourself, and trust me, they're not hard to find. If you tuned in today to find out about the details of the Jonestown Massacre, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I won't be delving into the details of the massacre itself. The reason I won't is because the details of the massacre have actually been covered pretty extensively in a variety of different places already. You can just search the internet and find out plenty. You don't watch my show to find out what you already know or what's widely known. You watch my show to discuss topics that are not widely known. Like the fact that nobody ever actually drank Kool-Aid in the first place, despite the fact that we keep saying it over and over again 43 years later. I feel sorry for the owners of the Kool-Aid brand. For 43 years, they've had their brand tainted by a massacre that had absolutely nothing to do with it. I do feel better, though, knowing that some people out there know the truth.
You know how everyone says they drink the Kool-Aid? Well, what you don't know, and check this out because it might blow your mind. The ingredients in the drink, it wasn't Kool-Aid. Well, the thing that killed them was cyanide, of course. But people think that it was Kool-Aid in the drink. It wasn't Kool-Aid. It was Flavor Aid. But Kool-Aid is a more popular drink, so people just went with that. So next time somebody says to you, don't drink the Kool-Aid, you can say, I will also not drink the Flavor Aid too, thank you very much. So that's a fun fact.
And now you know too. I'll address the highlights of what people think they know about the Jim Jones Massacre, only because it's still appropriate to do that before uncovering any topic. So here goes. The mainstream story is that Jim Jones was the pastor of a church called the People's Temple that existed between the years of 1955 to 1978. The church started in Indianapolis, eventually moved to San Francisco, and terminated in Jonestown, Guyana, where most of his congregation was convinced to commit suicide after drinking a mixture of grape Flavor Aid and cyanide. Others visiting Jonestown who were not part of his congregation were murdered. This is mostly the story that's been told for 43 years now. Today I want to talk about the real story of Jim Jones, the story the media doesn't like to harp on for what will soon become obvious reasons, what you may not know What you may not know is nearly everything that the mainstream media has said about Jim Jones, the People's Temple, the Jonestown Massacre, in the context of why the organization existed in the first place is BS. Did you know that the members of the People's Temple, upon their death, left all their belongings to the Soviet Union? That's right. They didn't leave their wealth to their families. They didn't leave it to their favorite charity. They didn't even leave it to their own freaking church. They left it to a country that most of them hadn't even been to before. This alone speaks volumes about what their organization truly was. Wikipedia says Jim Jones was an American cult leader, a political activist, a preacher, a faith healer who led a new religious organization. But how much of this was true? I'll give you a little bit of background about Jim Jones and I'll let you decide. Hiding the truth, the beginnings. Jim Jones was born in Indiana, and he wasn't raised in the Christian or church tradition. According to a childhood friend of Jones, at the age of 10, he attended a Pentecostal church. When the pastor would ask who needed to be saved, Jones would raise his hand. The only problem is, Jones would raise his hand every week. You only get saved once. Jones's friend thought this practice was rather odd. There was obviously something about the attention that Jones loved. Pretty soon, Jones started preaching to animals, kids, trees. He got pretty good at it, even though he wasn't a believer himself. By the time he attended Indiana University, he had met some Marxists who made an impact on him. His mother was a Marxist as well. He used to ponder what would be the best way to demonstrate his Marxism. He thought that perhaps infiltrating the church would be the best way. He started preaching locally in Indiana. Garrett Lambrov was one of Jones's first converts to what would later be the People's Temple. Right from the start, Lambrov's intuition let him know something was amiss with Jones. Lambrov held a master's degree from Stanford, with a particular interest in Russia. Lambrov noticed that Jones had an unusual fascination with the Soviet Union. During the classes that Jones taught to church members, occasionally he would digress into something flattering about the Soviet Union. After listening to this on many occasions, one day Lambrov couldn't take it anymore, and he raised his hand and he asked Jones, "What about the gulags? What about the 10 million people who starved to death?" Jones went off on Lambrov in front of everybody. He screamed at Lambrov, calling him a spoiled upper-middle-class intellectual, a young bourgeois. Jones later apologized to Lambrov in private, claiming that he had to yell at him that way because he was challenging his authority in front of the group. This was perhaps the earliest clue that Jones was clearly passionate about something other than Christ. Have you seen the movie Catch Me If You Can? It's the true story of a con man named Frank Abagnale. Leonardo DiCaprio plays Abagnale in the movie. One of the cons Abagnale pulls is when he impersonates a pilot. Wikipedia makes it very clear, however, that Abagnale was not an actual pilot. Disguising himself as a pilot was merely one of the cons he used to rip off the general public, which is the reason why I'm challenging some of Wikipedia's previous posting about Jim Jones. Let's look at it again. Wikipedia says he was an American cult leader. I agree with that. They say he was a political activist. I agree with that too. One of the problems I have is the underlying belief of his cult and his political activism are both linked. It's the driving force of everything. But Wikipedia makes these separate when it's a vital piece in understanding what the People's Temple really was. When you say he was a preacher, yes, but what was he later found to be preaching? Wikipedia says he was a faith healer, and the People's Temple was a new religious organization. But years later, in 1972, Lester Consolving, an actual ordained priest and religious editor for the San Francisco Examiner, wrote an 8-part expose on the practices of Jim Jones in the People's Temple. The exposés targeted everything from Jones's fake claims of raising people from the dead, to exploiting people financially, to his fake healing powers, to physical abuse and authorizing an underage minor to be married in his church. All of these warnings were written a full 6 years before the massacre that eventually occurred in 1978. But the People's Temple mounted a protest outside of the Examiner's office, and they started a massive letter-writing campaign to kill the series that was being written by Consolving. Out of the 8 exposés that were written, they killed the series after the first 4 were published, and they just write off Consolving as a crazy conservative reporter. Here's the first time that an actual ordained minister himself confronts Jones. So Wikipedia's claim of Jones being a faith healer or the People's Temple being a true religious organization is already being exposed and debunked as early as 1972. And obviously a lot had to have occurred before 1972 in order for Consolving to have enough material for an 8-part expose. In his early days, Jones had been accustomed to having to tailor his message. To anyone who was around Jones for any length of time, it was apparent that Jones's true message wasn't Christianity, but socialism. He was wearing out his welcome in Indiana, so he moved to, where else? California, of course. His congregation was originally comprised of white people, but as he moved to Brazil, and from Brazil to Redwood Valley, from Redwood Valley to San Francisco, and from San Francisco to Los Angeles, he was learning to hide his socialism more and more, because as he kept moving, the demographics of his congregation were starting to change. More black people started to attend Jones's church. Eventually, blacks made up 70% of Jones's church, with 45% of them being black women, who are quite religious. As a means of recruiting more members, Jones relied on a phony faith healing. He routinely used chicken gizzards as a prop to show that he had removed the cancer from someone who was sick. But some of Jones's hardcore followers from early on knew who he was, and they knew he was a socialist. The daily challenge for Jones was feigning Christianity while preaching socialism, using God as the bait while being an atheist. To this day, there still exists a 24-page document created by Jim Jones called The Letter Killeth. The Letter Killeth was designed to discredit the Bible and claim that the Bible was a bunch of lies. If the People's Temple was a new religious organization, please tell me what religion exactly. Because when Jones eventually moved to Jonestown, Guyana, he forbid even married couples from having sex unless he authorized it. If by chance someone ended up pregnant, they would have to get an abortion on his orders. So what religion is this? The racial makeup of the church was only significant because there was an interesting dynamic happening within the church. Most of the whites who attended already knew that Jones was a socialist, but they had to sit through the fake faith healing garbage in order to hear the socialist message of the day. And most of the blacks didn't care about the socialist garbage. They only attended because they actually believed in the Bible and thought that Jones might actually have the power to heal the sick. Over time, Jones started to get bolder with his message. He started referring to socialism as God. And since, of course, he was the perfect embodiment of socialism, that meant he was God. He referred to the Bible as your black book, and once flung the Bible across the church and even stomped on it. This is not Christian fundamentalism. If Wikipedia can say that Frank Abagnale was not a pilot but an impersonator, then surely they can say the truth about Jim Jones, that he was not a pastor, but a left-wing fundamentalist who persuaded nearly 1,000 people to commit suicide. Birds of a feather, Jim Jones and the Democrat Party. Keep in mind, this is Jim Jones's mind state before Democrat politicians and Hollywood stars gave him credibility and power. California was then, as it is today, a hotbed for socialists. It was the perfect state for Jim Jones to get his start. After the war, there were protest groups everywhere. The Weather Underground was hiding out in San Francisco. There was the 70s Liberation Army, the kidnapping of Patty Hearst. The New World Liberation Front put a bomb on Dianne Feinstein's daughter's windowsill, and they shot up her vacation home. In the words of Cult City author Daniel J. Flynn, with all these competing crazy groups, it was difficult to differentiate between political crazies and just plain crazy. In this kind of environment, Jim Jones doesn't look crazy. California sees him almost as a civic leader. As far back as January 6, 1961, Jones applied for the Indianapolis Human Rights Commission. He was appointed by Democrat Mayor Charles Boswell with no background check. After less than just 2 months on the job, the mayor and the commissioners ordered him to slow down his counterproductive appetite for publicity. Jones continued, however, and used his own position to land his own radio show on WIBC in Indiana. But all of this influence would pale in significance to the type of power he'd receive by the time he got to California. His rise to power. Jones moved to North California in 1965 and then to San Francisco in 1971. But it wasn't until 1975 that Democrats really started rolling out the red carpet for him. San Francisco Mayor Willie Brown is concerned about an upcoming mayoral election between Democrat George Moscone and Republican John Barbagelata. The race is tight, so Brown brokers a meeting with Jones to help with the campaign. Moscone ends up winning by 3,000 votes, and many people give Jim Jones the credit because he lent about 1,000 volunteers to the effort. It was also believed that Jones may have bussed people in from outside of California in order to cast ballots, and there was a big thing about election fraud. And there was supposedly a big investigation into election fraud, but even the investigation was suspect because the DA whose job it was to investigate the election fraud also worked for Jim Jones. Moscone rewards Jim Jones by appointing him as chairman of the Housing Commission Authority for San Francisco. Pause for a second. When you think of America's most famous criminals, the John Gacy's, the Jeffrey Dahmers, the Charles Mansons of the world, how much worse would it have been had they been put in a position of actual power? That's what George Moscone did when he effectively made Jim Jones the largest landlord in the city of San Francisco. In charge of 3,500 public housing units, Thanks to the Democrat Party, Jim Jones is now officially on the map. They knew as far back as 1972 that he was beating church members. They knew as far back as 1972 that he was stockpiling weapons. They knew about the fake faith healings. They knew about the underage marriages. They knew about the financial exploitation of his congregation and the leftist fundamentalism, and they ignored all of that because they wanted the power, and they were socialists too. Long before the poor people drank the Kool-Aid, the rich and powerful did. Like that time Jane Fonda wrote a letter to the People's Temple saying, and I quote, "I also recommit myself to your congregation as an active full participant, not only for myself, but because I want my 2 children to have the experience." Over the next few years, Fonda would come to Jones's defense on many occasions to vouch for his high moral standards and character. Then there's that time Pastor Cecil Williams awarded Jim Jones the Martin Luther King Jr. Humanitarian Award. The time the Los Angeles paper named Jim Jones Man of the Year. And that time Religion and American Life magazine named Jones among the 100 most important clergymen. This is 1977. But Jones had already leased 3,000 acres of land from the Guyanese government back in 1973. At a time when thousands upon thousands of people were fleeing the communist government under Forbes Burnham, Jones was planning to move his entire congregation to Guyana to build a socialist heaven on earth called Jonestown. Democrats made Jones the guy to call if you were a Democrat who was in need of help with your political campaign. And there was one guy who needed Jones desperately. His name was Harvey Milk. Today it's somewhat fashionable in the Democrat Party to elect someone gay. But back in the 70s, it still wasn't widely accepted. Milk ran for a seat on the city's Board of Supervisors back in 1973, and he lost. He ran again in 1975, and he lost. He ran again in 1976, and he lost a 3rd time. It's not until he links up with Jim Jones that he's finally taken seriously. Until then, he was just seen as the novelty candidate, the gay candidate. Jones provides Milk with hundreds of volunteers, a platform to speak on, access to a printing press, distribution in the church's newspaper, which has a black readership. Milk is finally elected in 1977 and becomes arguably Jones's biggest supporter. When new reports begin to surface about the People's Temple beating people, it's Milk who vouches for the integrity of Jones. Milk is so far out on a limb for Jones that he does the unthinkable. As Jones begins to move to Guyana, he kidnaps a young boy named John Victor Stone, who is the son of 2 People's Temple members. Since the parents of the child defected from the temple and remained in the United States, Jones is concerned that the United States is going to intervene, come to Jonestown, and take that kid back. It's Harvey Milk who writes a letter to the President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, on behalf of Jim Jones. Here you can read the letter written by Harvey Milk denigrating the parents of the boy while writing a glowing recommendation for Jim Jones, effectively assisting Jim Jones in the kidnapping of a child. Reverend Jones is widely known in the minority communities here and elsewhere as a man of the highest character, who has undertaken constructive remedies for social problems which have been amazing in their scope and effectiveness. He is also highly regarded amongst church, labor, and civic leaders of a wide range in political persuasions. Our own Board of Supervisors has presented Reverend Jones with a certificate of honor. Then he says about Timothy and Grace Stone, which are the parents of the boy, Timothy and Grace Stone, the parties that are attempting to damage Reverend Jones's reputation and seriously disrupt the life of his son, John, have both already been discredited in the news media here. He ends the letter by saying to the president, not only is the life of a child at stake, who presently has loving, protective parents in Reverend and Mrs. Jones, but our official relations with Guyana could stand to be jeopardized to the potential great embarrassment of our State Department. Mr. President, the actions of Mr. Stone need to be brought to a halt. It is offensive to most in the San Francisco community and all who know Reverend Jones to see this kind of outrage taking place. Respectively, Harvey Milk. It's hard to know exactly where to stop with this story because the media paints Jim Jones as a pastor of a church gone wrong, when by all accounts, Jones's reach goes as high as to the President of the United States. When Rosalynn Carter came to California to campaign for her husband, Jimmy Carter, she was introduced to Jim Jones. Jones knew everyone in politics because the People's Temple was not a religious organization, as Wikipedia says. The People's Temple was a political organization disguised as a religious organization. Hell on earth, revealing the truth. By this time, Jones has kept up the lie for as long as he could. He's moved most of the congregation already down to Jonestown, Guyana, while at the same time trying to maintain a small presence in San Francisco. Every member back in Jonestown already knows they're a communist group. The only people in the dark are the people who still visit the church in California, who are shown the mainstream face of Christianity. In the meantime, pressures are mounting for an investigation into the church due to an article that's critical of the People's Temple written by New West magazine. Accusations had been made against the church before, some 5 years earlier in 1972, in the San Francisco Examiner. But this time the accusations did not come from a conservative. These accusations were coming from previous members of the church, people who had defected. Between the new expose and the new kidnapping charges against Jones personally, he's thinking maybe it's a good time to flee the United States and head to the jungles of Guyana, to the place he named Jonestown. The communist culture. Anyone doubting Jones's communist beliefs need only look at Jonestown for proof. The land he leased and named after himself was in a communist country. At a time when thousands were running away from communism, Jones was running to it. Out of nearly 1,000 people, Jones only let 5 survive the massacre. When interviewed, they said they felt like pioneers, like they were starting a future from scratch. This shows their own level of naivety, maybe not knowing or not caring that you don't own anything in communist governments. The entire jungle was leased by Jim Jones. In Jonestown, there is no such thing as Christmas. Despite the fact that Wikipedia calls the People's Temple a religious organization, all of the members there are well aware that they're all atheists. Many have changed their names to the names of prominent communists like Lenin, Stalin, and Che. The armed security force, whose job it is to keep everyone in order with guns if they have to, are known as the Red Brigade. And despite the fact that Jones had outstanding kidnapping charges against him, at issue in Jonestown was the fact that John Victor Stone was raised by the community. And under communism, since the boy was raised by the community, he no longer belonged to the parents. The boy belonged to the community. In their view, for the parents to claim that the boy was theirs was selfish. Revolutionary suicide. If you've watched my show for long enough, you know this isn't the first time I've said that those who study Marxism are consumed with revolutionary talk. This mindset that the proletariat will one day rise up against the bourgeois is embedded in the very culture of socialism. Today is November 18th, 1978 in Jonestown. The accusations against Jones and the People's Temple were so great that the pressure was mounting against politicians to actually visit Guyana and do a welfare check on the family members who had moved there. Reports were that members were there against their will, under threat of armed guards. Just the night before, Democrat Congressman Leo Ryan arrives in Jonestown with a small group of people. His aide, members of a group called Concerned Relatives, and a group of journalists all arrived to check things out for themselves. On the surface, everyone was on their best behavior and everything was great. Jones had prepped all of the members on what to say and how to act. All of the members are welcoming the outsiders, and the outsiders are trying to ignore the fact that there are men with guns surrounding them. Everything seems to be going well until one incident changes everything. Temple member Vernon Gosney hands a note to one of the journalists, Don Harris, who accompanied Leo Ryan. Gosney had never met Leo Ryan before. The journalist being so well dressed, Gosney thought he was slipping a note directly to the congressman. He was wrong. The journalist accidentally drops the note, then picks it up to give it back to Gosney. Upon seeing this, a young boy from the temple yells that one of the journalists is handing a note to one of the members, and the mood changes drastically. Gosney's note said that he wanted to leave the temple and go back to the United States with Congressman Ryan. Now that it was no longer a secret, the congressman asked if there was anyone else who wanted to leave. A few were bold enough to admit that they want to leave, but Gosney warns the congressman that he should leave immediately, because his life is in danger. Being naive, Ryan attempts to ease Gosney's fear, thinking he won't be killed because he's a U.S. congressman. Nearly 6 months prior to Ryan's visit, nearly all of the members of Congress had been warned that the members of People's Temple were planning to kill themselves in an act of revolutionary suicide. Revolutionary suicide is a phrase that Jones stole from a book written by another socialist, Huey P. Newton. Perhaps it never dawned on Ryan that killing a congressman would mean nothing if they were all planning to be dead. On the morning of November 18th, Ryan waits on the airstrip with about 15 people who are waiting to leave Jonestown when a truck full of gunmen pull up. They murder Ryan, 3 journalists, and one of the concerned relatives. One of the journalists plays dead when he observes the gunman walking around to the other victims, shooting them in the head. Once the killing starts, out of over 900 members, Jones only lets 5 escape. 2 left-wing lawyers and 3 other members who Jones tells them to take all their money and give it to the Soviet Union. Here's the irony of socialism. Socialism is said to be a revolution of the poor, rising up against the rich. But that day, 900 poor people lay dead, while the wealthy Democrats who supported Jones are still alive, absolutely senseless. 9 days later, George Moscone and Harvey Milk are assassinated by another politician, Dan White, in supposedly an unrelated incident, which only puts a punctuation on this entire era of craziness. The most failed political philosophy on the planet. I'd have a lot more respect if someone in the Democrat Party would just tell the truth and say, they knew Jones, they were friends with him, they just didn't see this coming. I could respect that. It happens. I mean, we can't all be responsible for the actions of other people. But I can't respect a party that is so adamant about tearing down statues, but you've erected an entire San Francisco airport terminal dedicated to Harvey Milk, who was the biggest apologist for Jim Jones. I know this show is about Jim Jones, but I also can't respect that you know about the alleged incidents of Harvey Milk with young boys. And you still let Obama give Harvey Milk the Presidential Medal of Freedom. I'd have a lot more respect for you, Wikipedia, if you didn't treat us like we were dummies. The very photo you used of Carlton B. Goodlett is a photo you know was cropped. Only people who have the original photo know who is standing immediately to the right of Goodlett. Just 2 days after the massacre, Goodlett goes public to defend Jones. At this point, he knows Jones is responsible for killing over 900 people. Wikipedia, you say his reputation was tarnished, but was Goodlett's reputation tarnished in California's eyes? I mean, the address of the most prestigious building in the city is named after him. I'm just in awe at the number of people who not only endorsed Jones, but in some cases compared him to Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. Jimmy Carter writes a memoir of his presidency and doesn't mention Jim Jones at all. How can that be? It was one of the biggest catastrophes of your administration. Willie Brown is just as bad. When he writes his memoir, he talks about Jones like he's some obscure individual and he can't figure out how this guy ever got all this power. You know how he got all the power. You introduced him to everybody. But the people I'm perhaps the most disappointed in are the Democrat voters who still support this nonsense. I recently watched a Netflix special about the tennis player Naomi Osaka. They've been wanting to give her more attention now ever since she's decided to become a political activist. But all I could do was shake my head when I looked at the television and saw the book her boyfriend was reading. Nearly 43 years later, nearly 1,000 bodies strewn out everywhere. And some people haven't learned a thing about the dangers of socialism.
One of the most common talking points is the myth that socialism was not tried over the last 100 years, when in reality, it has been tried on every continent, in every major geopolitical arena, and it has never, ever worked. Let me tell you, every country socialism has failed, which is everywhere it has been tried. Here we go. Maoist China, Cuba, Laos, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Albania, Angola, Belarus, Bulgaria, Cambodia, People's Republic of Congo, Czechoslovakia, Ethiopia, Germany, East Germany, Hungary, North Korea, Mongolia, Mozambique, Poland, Romania, Somalia, Russia, France, Ukraine, North Vietnam, Italy, South Yemen, Yugoslavia, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Tunisia, Algeria, Burma, Egypt, Iraq, Libya, Madagascar, Sudan, Syria, Bolivia, the Congo, Ecuador, England, El Salvador, Rwanda, Guinea-Bissau, India, Ghana, Tanzania, Uruguay, Venezuela, Pakistan, Australia, Brazil, Canada, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Lithuania, Moldova, Latvia, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Benin, Argentina, Dominica, Honduras, Taiwan, Guatemala, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Peru, Paraguay, and Nicaragua.
Well, you know we never get it all, but we unpacked a lot. In this episode, we unpacked what you think you may already know about Jim Jones, and we talked about what you may not know. We talked about hiding the truth, the beginnings of Jim Jones. We talked about birds of a feather, Jim Jones and the Democrat Party, and what they have in common. We talked about Jim Jones's rise to power. How did he get to be so powerful in the first place? We talked about Hell on Earth, revealing the truth of Jim Jones and how that led to him having to flee the country to Jonestown, Guyana. We talked about the communist culture in Jonestown, Guyana. We talked about revolutionary suicide and how there's still people crazy enough to vote for socialism, even though it's the most failed political philosophy on the planet. Make sure you stick around for our next podcast, Is America Racist? Because some of you must not get out much. To your left is the show that answers, Is America Racist? To your right is our latest show. Click either one of them to go there right now. I'll conclude with the words of Thomas Sowell. Socialism is a wonderful idea. It is only as a reality that it has been disastrous. I'm Rob Lett, and I approve this message.